In the mountains of Afghanistan, where the wind carries both prayers and gunfire, there exists a code among warriors that transcends nationality, gender, and politics. When bullets fly and brothers fall, only one thing matters: getting everyone home alive. This is the story of Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, a Marine Corps sniper whose legend was born not in the clean halls of military academies, but in the dust and chaos of a firefight that lasted 3 days and changed the course of a war that few understood, but many died fighting. They say heroes are made in moments when ordinary people face extraordinary circumstances. But Maria Santos was never ordinary. From the barrios of East Los Angeles to the killing fields of Helmand Province, she carried something that couldn't be taught in boot camp or learned from textbooks: an unbreakable will to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. When Navy SEALs whisper that they're pinned down, when America's most elite warriors call for help, you know something has gone terribly wrong. What happened on that October morning in 2012 would test everything Maria believed about duty, sacrifice, and the thin line between life and death. This is her story. This is the day one woman became legend. The morning sun painted the Afghan mountains in shades of gold and amber, but Staff Sergeant Maria Santos wasn't admiring the view. She was calculating wind speed, distance, and the likelihood that today would be the day she didn't make it home to see her daughter's 7th birthday. The radio crackled to life in her earpiece, breaking the silence that had settled over Forward Operating Base Chapman like a heavy blanket. Reaper 6, this is Falcon 7. We have movement in Sector 4. Multiple hostiles. Request immediate support. The voice was calm, professional, but Maria caught the undercurrent of tension. She'd been doing this long enough to read between the lines of military speak. When Navy SEALs requested immediate support, it meant they were walking into hell. Maria adjusted her position on the rocky outcrop that served as her overwatch position. Her rifle, a customized M40A5 that she'd named Esperanza after her grandmother, felt familiar in her hands. The weapon had been her constant companion for 3 tours in Afghanistan, and together they'd sent more than 60 enemy combatants to whatever afterlife awaited them. She didn't take pride in the killing, but she took pride in keeping her people alive. Below her position, the valley stretched out like a brown scar across the landscape. Intelligence reports indicated that Taliban fighters had been using the area as a staging ground for attacks on supply convoys. The SEALs' mission was straightforward: infiltrate, gather intelligence, and eliminate any immediate threats. Maria's job was simpler: watch their backs and make sure they all came home. Reaper 6 copies, Falcon 7. Eyes on Sector 4. I count 12 hostiles, armed with AK-47s and what appears to be a PCAM machine gun. They're setting up an ambush position near the old mud brick compound. Maria's voice was steady as she relayed the information through her radio. Her scope revealed more details that made her stomach tighten. The Taliban fighters weren't just armed. They were well organized and appeared to be expecting company. Lieutenant Commander Jake Hawk Morrison led the 8-man SEAL team through the valley. At 34, he was a veteran of special operations with tours in Iraq and Afghanistan under his belt. His team trusted him implicitly, and he'd never lost a man under his command. But as they moved deeper into the valley, something felt wrong. The usual sounds of rural Afghanistan, children playing, livestock moving, the distant call of farmers, were absent. The silence was oppressive, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Hawk, this is Reaper 6. Recommend you hold position. Something doesn't feel right about this. Maria's voice came through his earpiece as he crouched behind a low stone wall, studying the terrain ahead. His instincts agreed with hers, but their orders were clear. Intelligence suggested a high-value target was in the area, and they couldn't afford to let him slip away. Reaper 6, we're tracking your concern, but we have our orders. Continue Overwatch. Hawk's response was professional, but Maria could hear the frustration in his voice. Special operations teams often found themselves caught between the reality on the ground and the demands of commanders who saw the battlefield through satellite feeds and intelligence reports. Maria swept her scope across the valley again, and this time she saw something that made her blood run cold. Movement in 3 separate positions suggested this wasn't just a 12-man Taliban cell. This was a coordinated ambush involving at least 30 fighters, possibly more. The SEALs were walking into a trap that could wipe out the entire team. Falcon 7, abort mission. Repeat, abort mission. You are walking into a kill zone with approximately 30 hostiles in prepared positions. I count muzzle flashes from multiple weapon systems, including what appears to be a DSHK heavy machine gun. Maria's voice carried urgency now, but she maintained her professional demeanor even as her heart rate spiked. The response came not from Hawk, but from their commanding officer back at base. Reaper 6, maintain position and provide overwatch as directed. Falcon 7, continue mission. Intelligence indicates HVT is in the area, and we cannot afford to lose this opportunity. Maria closed her eyes for a moment, fighting the urge to abandon her position and intercept the SEAL team herself. She'd seen too many good men die because someone sitting in an air-conditioned command center decided that a mission objective was worth more than the lives of the operators on the ground. But she was a Marine, and she followed orders, even when those orders felt like they were written in the blood of the men she was supposed to protect. The SEALs continued their advance, moving with the fluid precision that came from years of training and combat experience. Hawk split his team into 2 4-man elements, planning to approach the target compound from different angles. It was sound tactical doctrine, but Maria could see from her elevated position that they were moving exactly where the Taliban wanted them to go. As the morning sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows across the valley floor, Maria found herself thinking about her daughter, Isabella. 7 years old next week, with her father's dark eyes and Maria's stubborn determination. Isabella didn't really understand what Mommy did for work, only that she went away to help people and always came back with stories and small gifts. Maria had promised herself that this would be her last tour, that she'd find a way to serve her country without leaving Isabella to wonder if Mommy was coming home. The first shots came at 0947 hours, just as Hawk's team reached the rally point 200 meters from the target compound. The distinctive crack of AK-47 fire echoed across the valley, followed immediately by the deeper chatter of machine guns. Maria's scope found the muzzle flashes instantly, and she began engaging targets with methodical precision. Falcon 7 is taking effective fire from multiple positions. We are pinned down and request immediate support. Hawk's voice came through the radio with the kind of controlled urgency that spoke of years of combat experience. Maria could hear the gunfire in the background, the sharp crack of incoming rounds, and the shouted commands as the SEALs tried to find cover in terrain that offered precious little protection. Maria's first shot took down a Taliban fighter who was maneuvering to flank the SEAL position. The range was 437 meters, with a crosswind of 8 knots from the northeast. The bullet found its mark with the precision that had made Maria one of the most respected snipers in the Marine Corps. But even as the enemy fighter fell, she could see more positions lighting up with muzzle flashes. Reaper 6 engaging. Multiple targets neutralized, but they have you surrounded. I count at least 4 machine gun positions and approximately 25 rifle-armed fighters. Maria's voice remained calm as she continued to engage targets, but internally she was calculating angles, ammunition, and the growing realization that 8 SEALs and 1 Marine sniper were facing impossible odds. The Taliban had prepared this ambush with military precision. They'd studied the approach routes, identified the most likely overwatch positions, and prepared interlocking fields of fire that turned the valley into a killing ground. As Maria engaged target after target, more fighters seemed to appear from spider holes and concealed positions that hadn't been visible in the initial intelligence assessment. Hawk's team fought with the kind of disciplined aggression that defined special operations forces. They moved in pairs, covering each other's movement while laying down suppressing fire on enemy positions. But they were vastly outnumbered, and the Taliban fighters held the high ground on 3 sides of their position. What should have been a routine intelligence gathering mission had become a fight for survival. Command, this is Falcon 7. We are heavily outnumbered and taking casualties. Request immediate air support and medevac. Over. Hawk's transmission carried a weight that Maria had never heard in his voice before. The SEAL commander was not given to panic or exaggeration, and his request for medevac meant that at least one of his men was down. The response from base was not what they needed to hear. Falcon 7, air assets are committed to another operation. Closest support is 30 minutes out. Hold position and wait for support. The clinical detachment in the commander's voice spoke of a man who saw the battlefield as a chessboard rather than a place where real people bled and died. Maria felt something snap inside her as she listened to the exchange. 30 minutes might as well have been 30 hours given the intensity of fire the SEALs were taking. She could see from her position that the Taliban fighters were already beginning to maneuver for a final assault on the pinned-down Americans. In 30 minutes, there might not be anyone left to rescue. Falcon 7, this is Reaper 6. I'm moving to a better position to provide support. Hold tight. Maria's decision was made in an instant, driven not by orders or tactical doctrine, but by something deeper. These men were her brothers, and she would not watch them die while she sat safely on a hillside. The rocky terrain cut into Maria's knees and elbows as she low-crawled through the scattered boulders, moving toward the sound of gunfire that seemed to grow more intense with each passing minute. Her ghillie suit, designed to blend with the brown and tin landscape of Afghanistan, caught on thorns and sharp stones, but she ignored the discomfort. Every second counted now, and the radio chatter in her earpiece painted a grim picture of the situation developing below. Man down. We need a corpsman. The voice belonged to Petty Officer Marcus Tank Rodriguez, the team's heavy weapons specialist. Maria had worked with Tank on 2 previous operations, and she'd never heard fear in his voice before. Today was different. Today, the fear was real and justified. Maria reached a position that offered both concealment and a clear field of view toward the SEAL team's location. What she saw through her scope made her stomach clench. The Taliban had executed their ambush with devastating effectiveness. The SEALs were trapped in a depression that offered minimal cover, surrounded by enemy fighters who held commanding positions on the surrounding ridges. Through her scope, Maria could see Petty Officer First Class David Doc Williams working frantically over a wounded teammate while bullets kicked up dust around his position. Doc was the team's medic, a soft-spoken man from Georgia who could feel dress awound while under fire and still find time to crack jokes to keep morale up. Today, his usual calm demeanor was replaced by the focused intensity of a man fighting to save a life. The wounded SEAL was Petty Officer Second Class Tommy Rabbit Chun, the team's communications specialist. Maria could see the dark stain spreading across his uniform, and the way he lay motionless while Doc worked on him. Rabbit was barely 23 years old, married to his high school sweetheart, with a baby girl he'd never seen. Maria had listened to him talk about his daughter during countless hours of guard duty and mission prep. Falcon 7, this is Reaper 6. I have eyes on your position and am moving to provide close support. What's your status on Rabbit? Maria kept her voice steady, professional, even as she calculated the distances and angles needed to start thinning out the enemy forces surrounding the trapped SEALs. Hawk's response came through bursts of automatic weapons fire. Rabbit took one in the chest. Doc's working on him now, but we need that medevac yesterday. We're down to about 30% ammunition and taking fire from all sides. How copy? Maria's scope swept across the enemy positions, identifying priority targets. The Taliban fighters were using a combination of natural cover and prepared fighting positions that suggested they'd been planning this ambush for weeks, possibly months. Intelligence failures had walked the SEALs into a carefully orchestrated trap, and now it was up to her to help them fight their way out. I copy all, Falcon 7. Stand by for immediate suppression of enemy positions. Danger close. Maria's warning gave the SEALs a few seconds to get their heads down before she began engaging the enemy fighters who posed the most immediate threat to their position. Her first target was a machine gunner positioned on a ridge approximately 350 meters from the SEAL position. The Taliban fighter was feeding belted ammunition into a PCAM machine gun that had been raking the American's position with devastating accuracy. Maria's bullet struck him center mass, dropping him instantly and silencing the weapon that had been pinning down half of Hawk's team. But even as that threat was eliminated, Maria could see more fighters moving into position. The Taliban commander was clearly experienced and well-trained, using small unit tactics that suggested military training, possibly from foreign advisors. As soon as one position was neutralized, fighters moved to alternate positions and continued the assault. The second target was more challenging. A Taliban sniper had positioned himself in the ruins of an old watchtower, nearly 600 meters from the SEAL position. Maria could see the muzzle flash when he fired, and she watched through her scope as his bullets came dangerously close to Doc Williams, who was still working to stabilize Rabbit's injuries. The shot required careful calculation. The distance, combined with wind conditions and the angle of engagement, pushed the limits of what Maria could accomplish with iron sights and instinct. She controlled her breathing, let out half a breath, and squeezed the trigger with the kind of smooth pressure that came from thousands of hours of training. The bullet's flight time seemed to stretch into eternity. Through her scope, Maria watched the Taliban sniper's head snap back as the round found its mark. The threat to the SEAL's medic was eliminated, but Maria knew that her muzzle flashes had probably revealed her position to other enemy fighters. Almost immediately, she began taking incoming fire. Bullets whined off rocks around her position, and the distinctive crack of rounds passing close to her head told her that at least one enemy sniper had acquired her location. Maria rolled to her left, seeking better cover while trying to maintain visual contact with the SEAL team's position. Reaper 6, we see your muzzle flashes. You've got at least 3 fighters moving on your position from the northeast. You need to displace now. Hawk's warning came just as Maria spotted the movement he'd described. 3 Taliban fighters with AK-47s were bounding toward her position, using fire and movement tactics to close the distance. Maria's training kicked in automatically. She engaged the closest fighter with her sidearm, a Beretta M9 that had been her backup weapon for 6 years. The range was less than 50 meters, close enough that she could see the determination in the enemy fighter's eyes as he raised his rifle toward her position. The pistol bucked in her hand, and the Taliban fighter stumbled and fell, his weapon clattering against the rocks. But the other 2 fighters had reached positions where they could bring effective fire on her location. Maria found herself in the position that every sniper dreaded, compromised, outnumbered, and running low on options. Falcon 7, this is Reaper 6. I'm taking effective fire and need to displace. Can you provide covering fire on the ridge line to my northeast? Maria's request was tactical necessity, but she knew it would force the already embattled SEALs to divide their attention and ammunition between their own survival and helping her. The response came in the form of accurate rifle fire from the SEAL position. Chief Petty Officer Jake "Bulldog" Matthews, the team's senior enlisted man, had acquired targets on the ridge and was engaging them with his M4 rifle. Bulldog was a 20-year veteran who'd served in every major conflict since the Gulf War. His experience and steady hand bought Maria the few seconds she needed to bound to a new position. As she moved, Maria could hear the distinctive whine of an incoming mortar round. The Taliban had brought indirect fire weapons into the engagement, escalating the threat level beyond anything the SEAL team was equipped to handle. The round impacted 50 meters from the SEAL position, close enough that Maria could see the shock wave ripple through the air. Incoming. Mortars. Hawk's warning came just as a second round impacted even closer to the SEAL position. The Taliban forward observer was walking the rounds in on target, and Maria realized that the enemy had more than just small arms and machine guns. This was a regiment-sized element with heavy weapons and the tactical sophistication to coordinate complex attacks. Doc Williams threw himself across Rabbit's wounded form as shrapnel from the mortar round peppered their position. Maria could see the medic's lips moving, probably offering words of comfort to his wounded teammate, even as more rounds began falling around them. The image burned itself into Maria's memory, a young man risking his life to protect someone even more vulnerable, embodying everything she believed about military service and brotherhood. From her new position, Maria had a clearer view of the mortar crew. They'd set up their weapon in a depression that offered excellent concealment from air attack, but left them partially exposed to ground observation. The range was extreme for a rifle shot, nearly 800 meters through difficult terrain, but Maria had made longer shots under better conditions. The challenge was that she only had one opportunity. If she missed, the mortar crew would displace to a new position where she couldn't engage them. If she succeeded, she would eliminate the greatest threat to the surrounded SEAL team. The decision was easy. The execution would be anything but. Maria studied the wind conditions, noting the way dust and debris moved across the valley floor. The morning heat was creating thermal currents that would affect bullet trajectory, and she had to account for the fact that she was shooting downhill at a significant angle. Every variable had to be calculated perfectly because there would be no second chance. Through her scope, she could see the mortar crew preparing to fire another round. The gunner was adjusting elevation while his assistant fed another round into the tube. In seconds, another high-explosive round would be arcing toward the trapped Americans, possibly landing close enough to kill or wound the entire team. Maria's breathing slowed to the rhythm she'd practiced thousands of times on ranges from Camp Pendleton to Quantico. Her finger found the trigger, applying pressure with the kind of steady control that separated professional snipers from casual marksmen. The world narrowed to the image in her scope. Crosshairs aligned on center mass of the Taliban mortar gunner, wind speed and direction calculated, range estimated and adjusted for. The shot felt perfect the moment she squeezed the trigger. Maria could sense the bullet's path even before she saw the impact through her scope. The mortar gunner collapsed backward, his weapon rendered useless without someone trained to operate it. The immediate threat to the SEAL team was eliminated, but Maria knew it was only a temporary reprieve. As if to confirm her assessment, the radio crackled with a new threat assessment from Hawk's position. Reaper 6, we have vehicles approaching from the south. Count 4 trucks with mounted weapons and approximately 20 dismounted fighters. We are about to be seriously outnumbered here. Maria shifted her scope toward the south and felt her heart sink. The sound of approaching vehicles mixed with the continued crack of rifle fire and the shouts of men locked in mortal combat. Maria counted her remaining ammunition, 14 rounds in her rifle, 3 full magazines for her sidearm, and 2 fragmentation grenades. Against a reinforced company of Taliban fighters with heavy weapons and vehicles, it wasn't much. But she'd learned long ago that in combat, attitude mattered more than equipment. Through her scope, Maria watched the lead vehicle navigate around a large boulder that marked the entrance to the valley floor. The truck was a modified Toyota Hilux with a DSHK heavy machine gun mounted in the bed. The weapon system could punch through light armor and had an effective range that exceeded her rifle. If that gun crew got into position, they could decimate the SEAL team in minutes. The shot was complicated by the vehicle's movement and the fact that she needed to hit the gunner, not just the truck. Disabling the vehicle might stop its movement, but a trained crew could dismount and continue to operate the heavy weapon from a static position. She needed to eliminate the human element that made the weapon dangerous. Maria led the target, calculating the vehicle's speed and direction while accounting for the bullet's flight time over a distance of approximately 400 meters. The Toyota was moving at roughly 30 kilometers per hour across uneven terrain, causing it to bounce and sway in a pattern that made precision shooting extremely difficult. The crosshairs settled on the gunner just as the vehicle hit a smooth patch of ground. Maria squeezed the trigger, and through her scope, she watched the heavy machine gunner slump forward over his weapon. The truck continued moving, but the most immediate threat had been neutralized. But even as the first vehicle's gunner fell, the second truck was maneuvering into position. This one carried a different weapon system, a Soviet-era SPG-9 recoilless rifle that could destroy light vehicles and fortified positions with a single well-placed shot. If that weapon engaged the SEAL position, the rocky depression that provided their only cover could become their tomb. Falcon 7. You've got a recoilless rifle setting up on your 3 o'clock. I'm engaging now, but you need to be ready to move if I miss. Maria's warning gave the SEALs precious seconds to prepare for movement while she lined up what might be the most important shot of her military career. The recoilless rifle crew was professional and efficient. Maria could see them adjusting the weapon's elevation and traversing it toward the SEAL position. In seconds, they would fire a round that could kill or wound every member of Hawk's team. There was no time for careful calculation or perfect conditions. This shot had to be made right now. Maria's bullet struck the gunner in the upper chest, spinning him away from the weapon. But before she could congratulate herself on the successful engagement, she saw another fighter moving to take over the recoilless rifle. The Taliban fighters were well-trained and disciplined, with backup crew members ready to step in when casualties occurred. Her second shot dropped the replacement gunner, but she was beginning to realize that she was facing an enemy with depth and redundancy that exceeded anything in her previous experience. This wasn't a ragtag group of insurgents. This was a well-trained, well-equipped military unit that had planned this operation with professional competence. The radio crackled with an update from Doc Williams that made Maria's blood run cold. Falcon 7, Rabbit's lost a lot of blood. His pressure's dropping, and I'm running out of ways to keep him stable. We need that medevac now, or we're going to lose him. Maria could hear the frustration and desperation in the medic's voice. Doc Williams was a skilled corpsman who'd saved dozens of lives in his career, but even the best medical training had limits when dealing with severe trauma in a combat environment. Rabbit needed surgery and blood transfusions that couldn't be provided in a rocky depression under enemy fire. The situation was becoming untenable. The SEAL team was running low on ammunition. They had a critically wounded team member who needed immediate medical attention, and enemy reinforcements were continuing to arrive. Maria could see additional fighters moving into positions around the valley, creating an ever-tightening noose around the trapped Americans. But surrender wasn't an option. Maria had seen what happened to American prisoners in Taliban custody, and she knew that Hawk's team would fight to the last man before they allowed themselves to be captured. That knowledge gave her a clarity of purpose that cut through the chaos and confusion of the firefight. From her position, Maria could see that the Taliban commander was coordinating the attack from a position near the disabled vehicles. He was using a handheld radio to direct the placement of fighters and coordinate the timing of assaults on the SEAL position. If she could eliminate him, the attack might lose its coordination and give the Americans a chance to break contact. The range was extreme, nearly 700 meters through air that was beginning to shimmer with heat distortion. The target was partially concealed behind the engine block of one of the vehicles, presenting only a limited opportunity for engagement. But Maria had spent years training for shots exactly like this one. She adjusted her scope for the increased range and studied the wind conditions. The thermal currents rising from the sun-heated rocks created a challenging shooting environment, and she had to time her shot for a moment when the heat distortion was minimal. Through her scope, she could see the Taliban commander gesturing with his radio, clearly directing the ongoing attack. The shot felt right from the moment Maria squeezed the trigger. She could track the bullet's path through the scope, watching it arc across the valley and impact exactly where she'd aimed. The Taliban commander dropped his radio and fell backward, disappearing behind the vehicle that had provided his cover. Almost immediately, Maria could sense a change in the enemy's behavior. The coordinated assaults on the SEAL position became more sporadic, and she could see groups of fighters talking among themselves rather than advancing. The loss of leadership was having exactly the effect she'd hoped for, but she knew it was only temporary. Someone else would take command, and the attacks would resume with renewed intensity. Falcon 7, this is Reaper 6. I've eliminated what appeared to be the enemy commander, and their attacks have slacked off. This might be your window to displace to a better position. Maria's assessment was tactical and immediate. The brief lull in enemy activity might provide the only opportunity for the SEALs to improve their situation. Hawk's response revealed the extent of their predicament. Negative, Reaper 6. Rabbit can't be moved in his current condition, and we won't leave him behind. We're going to hold this position until medevac arrives or we run out of ammunition. Maria understood the decision even as it frustrated her. No SEAL would abandon a wounded teammate, regardless of the tactical situation. The brotherhood that defined Special Operations Forces meant that they would die together before they would leave someone behind. It was an admirable sentiment, but it also meant that all 9 Americans in the valley might die because of their unwillingness to abandon one. The temporary quiet was broken by the sound of rotors echoing off the valley walls. For a moment, Maria felt a surge of hope, thinking that the promised air support had finally arrived. But the sound was wrong. Too light, too fast. Through her scope, she could see a small helicopter approaching from the east, but it wasn't an American aircraft. Falcon 7. Incoming helicopter from the east. Not friendly. Appears to be in me. 8 with door gunners. Maria's warning came just as the helicopter swung into view, revealing the distinctive profile of a Soviet-designed transport helicopter that had been modified for combat operations. The helicopter's appearance changed everything. Maria could see fighters hanging out of both doors, equipped with machine guns and rocket-propelled grenades. The aircraft began circling the SEAL position, staying just outside the effective range of small arms while the door gunners raked the rocky depression with automatic weapons fire. Maria realized that she was looking at the endgame. The helicopter pilot never saw the bullet that ended his life. Maria's shot punched through the aircraft's windscreen and struck him center mass, causing him to slump forward over the controls. The helicopter immediately began an uncontrolled descent, its tail rotors swinging wildly as the aircraft spiraled toward the ground. Maria watched through her scope as the Mi-8 crashed into a cluster of Taliban fighters who had been positioning themselves for another assault on the SEAL position. The impact created a massive fireball that engulfed not only the aircraft but also a significant number of enemy combatants who had been using the area as a staging point for their attacks. The explosion sent shockwaves through both the valley and the enemy forces. Maria could see Taliban fighters running in all directions, some trying to escape the burning fuel that spread from the crashed helicopter, others simply fleeing in panic from what must have seemed like divine intervention on behalf of the Americans. Holy shit, Reaper 6. Did you just shoot down a helicopter with a sniper rifle? Tank Rodriguez's voice came through the radio with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Even the SEALs, accustomed to witnessing extraordinary feats of military prowess, were stunned by what they'd just seen. But Maria knew that the helicopter crash, spectacular as it was, had only bought them time. The Taliban forces were disorganized but not defeated, and once they recovered from the shock of losing their air support, they would resume their assault with even greater determination. The clock was still ticking toward an outcome that favored the enemy. Falcon 7. The crash has disrupted their attack, but we need to use this window to improve our position. Can you move Rabbit to better cover while they're still disorganized? Maria's tactical assessment was clear. They had minutes, possibly less, before the enemy regained their composure and renewed their assault. Doc Williams's response revealed the depth of their predicament. Negative on moving Rabbit. He's conscious, but barely, and any significant movement could cause internal bleeding that I can't control. We're stuck here until medevac arrives, or until we can stabilize him enough for transport. Maria understood the medical reality, but she also understood the tactical situation. The rocky depression that provided the SEALs only cover was surrounded on 3 sides by higher ground that gave the enemy commanding fields of fire. Once the Taliban reorganized, they could bring overwhelming firepower to bear on the trapped Americans. Through her scope, Maria could see enemy fighters beginning to regroup around the smoldering wreckage of the helicopter. A new leader had emerged, a tall figure in traditional Afghan clothing who was using hand signals to direct the repositioning of fighters around the valley. The Taliban forces were adapting to the loss of their helicopter and their original commander with a professionalism that spoke of extensive training and experience. The new Taliban commander was smart enough to learn from his predecessor's mistakes. Instead of using radio communications that might be intercepted or triangulated, he was using visual signals and runners to coordinate his forces. Maria could see fighters moving to new positions that would allow them to engage the SEAL team from multiple angles simultaneously. More concerning was the fact that additional enemy forces continued to arrive in the valley. Maria counted at least 40 fighters now, armed with everything from AK-47s to heavy machine guns and rocket-propelled grenades. The Americans were outnumbered by more than 4 to 1, and the odds were getting worse with each passing minute. Reaper 6, this is Falcon 7. We're seeing movement to our north and west. Looks like they're setting up for a coordinated assault from multiple directions. How much ammunition do you have remaining? Hawk's question was both tactical and personal. He needed to know what support Maria could provide, but he was also calculating whether they had enough firepower to survive the coming attack. Maria checked her remaining ammunition. 8 rounds for her rifle, 2 full magazines for her sidearm, and the 2 fragmentation grenades she'd been saving for emergencies. Against 40 enemy fighters, it wasn't much. But she'd learned in 3 tours of combat that battles weren't always won by the side with the most ammunition. Sometimes they were won by the side with the most determination. "I have enough," she replied, not specifying exactly what enough meant. In her mind, she had enough ammunition to continue fighting until either the SEALs were safe or she was dead. Beyond that, precise numbers didn't matter. The renewed Taliban assault began with a barrage of rocket-propelled grenades that turned the area around the SEAL position into a moonscape of smoking craters and flying debris. Maria could see the tactical sophistication of the new enemy commander in the way the attacks were coordinated. He was using the RPGs to suppress the American position while moving fighters into closer engagement ranges. Through the chaos of explosions and gunfire, Maria could hear Doc Williams continuing to work on Rabbit Chun. The young medic was performing what amounted to battlefield surgery while under direct fire, using techniques he'd learned in emergency trauma training to keep his patient alive in conditions that would challenge surgeons in the best hospitals. Rabbit's pressure is stabilizing, but he's lost a lot of blood. I need to get him to real medical care within the next hour, or we're going to lose him. Doc's update was clinical and professional, but Maria could hear the exhaustion and stress in his voice. He'd been working continuously for over an hour in conditions that would break most people. The tactical situation was becoming increasingly desperate. Maria could see Taliban fighters closing to within 100 meters of the SEAL position, using fire and movement techniques to advance while staying below the ridgeline that might expose them to her rifle. They were executing a textbook infantry assault with the kind of precision that suggested formal military training. Maria realized that her current position no longer provided the angles needed to effectively support the trapped SEALs. The enemy's movement had created dead spaces where Taliban fighters could advance without being exposed to her fire. If she remained in her current location, she would become irrelevant to the outcome of the battle. The decision to move again was both tactical and emotional. Tactically, she needed a position that would allow her to engage the advancing enemy forces. Emotionally, she couldn't remain in safety while watching her brothers fight for their lives against impossible odds. The brotherhood that defined military service meant that sometimes you had to risk everything for the people who would do the same for you. Maria's movement took her down the slope toward the valley floor, into terrain that offered less concealment but better fields of fire. She was moving closer to the enemy, deliberately placing herself in greater danger to increase her effectiveness. It was the kind of tactical decision that separated heroes from survivors. As she moved, a Taliban fighter spotted her and began directing fire in her direction. The distinctive crack of AK-47 rounds passing close to her head reminded Maria that she was now well within the enemy's engagement range. But instead of seeking cover, she dropped to a prone position and engaged the fighter who had spotted her. The shot was instinctive, fired without the careful calculation that characterized most of her engagements. At a range of less than 200 meters, with adrenaline affecting her fine motor control, Maria relied on muscle memory and years of training. The Taliban fighter dropped his weapon and fell backward, disappearing into the rocks that had concealed his position. But Maria's muzzle flash had revealed her new position to other enemy fighters. Almost immediately, she began taking fire from multiple directions. Bullets struck the rocks around her with the sharp crack that meant they were passing very close to her body. She was no longer a hidden sniper. She was a target in an open firefight. Rolling to her left, Maria sought cover behind a boulder that offered protection from the most immediate threats. But she could see that her movement had drawn attention away from the SEAL position. Taliban fighters who had been advancing on Hawk's team were now turning their weapons toward her location. "Reaper 6, you're drawing fire away from our position. We can see at least 6 fighters moving on your location from the southeast." Hawk's warning came with covering fire from the SEAL position. The team was using their remaining ammunition to engage Taliban fighters who were threatening Maria, even though it meant reducing their own defensive capabilities. The tactical situation had evolved into a mutual support scenario where the Americans were fighting as a team despite being separated by several hundred meters. The SEALs were supporting Maria's movement, while she used her position to engage threats to their location. It was the kind of integrated combat that represented the best traditions of American military teamwork. But teamwork couldn't overcome the fundamental math of the engaging, the thunder of Apache rotors mixed with the roar of 30mm cannon fire as the attack helicopters engaged Taliban positions throughout the valley. Maria could feel the concussions from Hellfire missiles as they impacted enemy strongpoints, and she watched through her scope as entire fighting positions disappeared in clouds of smoke and debris. But the air support that was devastating enemy forces hundreds of meters away couldn't help her with the immediate threat closing on her position. 3 Taliban fighters were maneuvering to within grenade range of Maria's location, using the chaos of the air attack to mask their movement. She could see them communicating with hand signals, coordinating their assault with the professionalism of trained infantry. These weren't farmers with rifles. They were soldiers who understood small unit tactics and knew how to exploit the dead spaces that even attack helicopters couldn't cover. Maria armed her first fragmentation grenade, calculating the timing needed to deliver it to the advancing enemy fighters. The M67 had a 4-second fuse delay, and she needed to account for the throw time and the enemy's movement. Too early, and they would have time to take cover. Too late, and the explosion would be ineffective. The grenade left her hand in a perfect arc, landing among the rocks where the Taliban fighters had taken cover. The explosion sent shrapnel whistling through the air and temporarily suppressed the enemy advance, but Maria could see that at least one of the fighters had survived and was continuing to move toward her position. Rolling to her right, Maria brought her sidearm to bear on the surviving Taliban fighter. The range was less than 30 meters, close enough that she could see the determination in his eyes as he raised his AK-47 toward her position. This was the kind of engagement that decided battles. Individual warriors facing each other with nothing but training, courage, and the will to survive. Maria's first pistol shot struck the fighter's center mass, but he remained on his feet and continued to advance. Her second shot dropped him, but not before he managed to fire several rounds in her direction. One of the bullets grazed her left shoulder, spinning her around and causing her to lose her grip on the Beretta. The wound was superficial but painful, and it served as a reminder of how close she was to the edge of survival. Maria retrieved her sidearm and checked her remaining ammunition, 1 full magazine plus whatever rounds remained in her rifle. Against an unknown number of enemy fighters who might still be approaching her position, it represented the difference between life and death. The Apache helicopters continued their devastating attack on Taliban positions throughout the valley, but Maria could see that some enemy fighters had found cover in caves and overhangs that protected them from air attack. These survivors would continue to pose a threat to the SEAL team even after the main Taliban force had been neutralized. Reaper 6. This is Thunder 1-1. We have you marked and are engaging enemy positions in your vicinity. Stay down and mark your position with smoke if you have it. The Apache pilot's voice was calm and professional, but Maria could hear the concern underlying his words. The attack helicopter crews knew that a friendly sniper was operating in the valley, but in the chaos of combat, identifying friend from foe was always challenging. Maria didn't have smoke grenades, but she used her remaining fragmentation grenade to mark her position for the Apache crews. The explosion created a distinctive smoke signature that would help the helicopter pilots identify her location and avoid engaging her by mistake. But it also marked her position for any surviving enemy fighters who might be looking for targets of opportunity. Through the continuing thunder of helicopter attacks, Maria could hear the distinctive sound of a medevac helicopter approaching from the south. The UH-60 Black Hawk was flying low and fast, using terrain features to mask its approach from any surviving enemy air defense systems. The sight of the medical helicopter filled Maria with relief, not for herself, but for Rabbit Chun, who had been fighting for his life for over 2 hours. Falcon 7, this is Dustoff 67. We're inbound for medical evacuation. Prepare patient for immediate transport. The medevac crew's transmission was followed by coordinated movements from the SEAL position as they prepared Rabbit for extraction while continuing to provide security in case any Taliban fighters remained in the area. Doc Williams had performed a miracle of battlefield medicine, keeping Rabbit stable through conditions that would challenge emergency room physicians. As the medevac helicopter touched down near the SEAL position, Maria could see the medic carefully transferring his patient to the aircraft's medical crew. Every movement was precise and deliberate, reflecting training that had been earned through years of treating wounded warriors in combat. The Black Hawk lifted off with Rabbit aboard, disappearing over the southern ridge as quickly as it had arrived. The successful medical evacuation marked a turning point in the engagement, transforming what had threatened to become a complete disaster into an operation where most of the Americans would survive to fight another day. But the battle wasn't over. Maria could see movement in the rocks near her position, suggesting that at least some Taliban fighters had survived the Apache attacks and were still seeking to engage the Americans. The enemy forces were disorganized and badly damaged, but they hadn't surrendered or withdrawn from the valley. Reaper 6, this is Falcon 7. Can you move to our position? We're preparing to extract, and we're not leaving without you. Hawk's transmission carried an order disguised as a request. The SEAL team commander had decided that the tactical situation was stable enough to consolidate forces and prepare for extraction. Maria's movement toward the SEAL position took her through terrain that had been devastated by the Apache attacks. Smoking craters marked where Hellfire missiles had impacted, and scattered equipment showed where Taliban fighting positions had been overrun by the overwhelming firepower of American air support. The valley floor looked like a moonscape, pocked with blast craters and littered with the debris of modern warfare. As she moved, Maria encountered a wounded Taliban fighter who was attempting to crawl toward a weapon that had been dropped during the air attacks. The man was badly injured and posed no immediate threat, but he represented the kind of tactical decision that defined combat, whether to show mercy to an enemy who might recover and fight again. Maria approached the wounded fighter cautiously, keeping her weapon trained on him while assessing his condition. He was young, probably in his early 20s, with the kind of fresh-faced appearance that reminded her of American soldiers she'd served with. The wound in his leg was severe but not immediately life-threatening, and his eyes showed pain and fear rather than continued aggression. The decision came easily. Maria used her medical kit to treat the wounded Taliban fighter's injury, applying a pressure bandage and pain medication that might save his life. It was the kind of humanity that distinguished professional soldiers from mere killers, and it reflected values that made military service about more than just violence and destruction. Why? The wounded fighter asked in accented English, looking up at Maria with confusion and gratitude. It was a question that encompassed the complexity of warfare in Afghanistan, where enemies could show mercy to each other even while their nations remained locked in conflict. Because you're wounded, and I'm a Marine, Maria replied simply. It was an answer that captured everything she believed about military service, that warriors could fight with courage and still maintain their humanity, that showing mercy was a sign of strength rather than weakness. Maria left the wounded Taliban fighter in a position where he could be found by his comrades or by coalition medical personnel. As she continued toward the SEAL position, she reflected on the strange paradox of warfare that allowed enemies to fight desperately and then show compassion to each other once the immediate threat had passed. The SEAL team had established a defensive perimeter around their original position, but the tactical situation had been transformed by the Apache attacks, where once they had been surrounded and outnumbered, they now controlled the battlefield with support from American air power. The balance of forces had shifted decisively in their favor. Outstanding work, Staff Sergeant, Hawk said as Maria reached the SEAL position. That helicopter shot was the most incredible piece of marksmanship I've ever seen, and your decision to leave your Overwatch position probably saved all our lives. The SEAL commander's praise carried special weight coming from someone who had witnessed extraordinary displays of courage throughout his special operations career. Doc Williams looked up from repacking his medical kit and nodded toward Maria's wounded shoulder. You're bleeding, Marine. Let me take a look at that. The medic's examination revealed that the bullet graze was superficial, requiring only cleaning and a bandage. But It served as a reminder of how close Maria had come to more serious injury during her movement through the valley. Tank Rodriguez was monitoring radio communications with the Apache helicopters, coordinating the continuing search for surviving Taliban fighters. Thunder 11 reports at least 30 enemy Kia and estimates that remaining Taliban forces have withdrawn from the valley. They're requesting a bomb damage assessment and recommendations for follow-up operations. The tactical debriefing would come later, but the immediate assessment was clear. The Taliban ambush had been defeated through a combination of SEAL teamwork, Marine Corps marksmanship, and American air power. What had begun as a near disaster had been transformed into a tactical victory that eliminated a significant enemy presence in the region. But the real measure of success wasn't the enemy casualties or the tactical objectives achieved. The real measure was that 9 American warriors had entered the valley, and 9 American warriors would leave it. Rabbit Chin would survive his wounds to see his daughter grow up. Doc Williams would continue saving lives on future missions. The SEAL team would remain intact to fight again when their country called. As they waited for extraction helicopters to arrive, Maria thought about the events of the past few hours. She had disobeyed direct orders to leave her overwatch position, engaged enemy forces at extreme range under difficult conditions, and shot down a helicopter with a sniper rifle. Any one of those actions could have resulted in court-martial proceedings under different circumstances. But Maria also knew that sometimes the right decision wasn't the one that followed regulations or tactical doctrine. Sometimes the right decision was the one that saved lives and upheld the values that made military service meaningful. She had sworn an oath to protect and defend, and she had honored that oath in the mountains of Afghanistan. The extraction helicopters arrived as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the valley that had witnessed so much violence and heroism. As Maria boarded the Black Hawk that would take her back to base, she looked out at the battlefield where she had learned something fundamental about herself and about the nature of military service. 3 months later, Maria Santos stood in the East Room of the White House, where President Obama presented her with the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism in combat. The citation mentioned her conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of her life above and beyond the call of duty, but it couldn't capture the complexity of decisions made in the heat of combat or the bonds forged between warriors who had faced death together. Isabella Santos, now 7 years old, watched from the audience as her mother received the nation's second-highest decoration for combat valor. She didn't fully understand the significance of the ceremony, but she knew that Mommy had done something important that made everyone proud. Years later, Isabella would read the citation and understand that her mother had risked everything to save the lives of men she barely knew. Maria returned to civilian life 6 months after the engagement in the Afghan valley, keeping her promise to spend more time with her daughter. But she carried with her the knowledge that when everything was on the line, when good men needed someone to stand with them against impossible odds, she had been equal to the challenge. The story of what happened in that valley became legend within the special operations community, told and retold in the bars and briefing rooms where warriors gathered to share tales of courage and sacrifice. It became a reminder that heroism isn't defined by rank or gender or the weapon you carry, but by the willingness to risk everything for the people who would do the same for you. Maria Santos had emerged from the storm with a sniper rifle, and when the shooting stopped, everyone who mattered was still alive. In the end, that was the only measure of success that truly counted. As enemy fighters closed on her position from multiple directions, Maria prepared to use her fragmentation grenades. The weapons were designed for close-range combat, and she was about to find herself in exactly that kind of fight. But before she could arm the first grenade, the sound of approaching aircraft echoed across the valley. This time, the sound was familiar and welcome. The distinctive rotor signature of American helicopters meant that the long-promised air support had finally arrived. Through the smoke and dust of the ongoing firefight, Maria could see 2 AH-64 Apache attack helicopters approaching from the west, their weapon systems already trained on the Taliban positions. Falcon 7, this is Reaper 6. Confirm friendly air support approaching from the west. Apache gunships, 2 aircraft. Maria's report was met with cheers from the SEAL position, the first expression of genuine hope she'd heard from the team in over an hour. But even as the Apaches began their attack runs on the Taliban positions, Maria knew that her own situation remained desperate. She was pinned down by enemy fighters who were too close for the helicopters to engage without risking her safety. The arrival of air support might save the SEAL team, but she was still fighting for her life against enemies who were now close enough that she could see their faces. Taliban had brought in air support to finish off the trapped Americans, and there was very little that a single Marine sniper could do against a helicopter gunship. Her rifle was effective against ground targets, but engaging aircraft required different weapons and tactics. But as Maria watched the helicopter circle, she noticed something that gave her an idea. The pilot was maintaining a predictable flight pattern, probably to give his door gunners the best possible firing positions on the SEAL team. If she could time it right, there might be a way to turn the helicopter from an asset into a liability for the Taliban forces. The plan was desperate and dangerous, but it was the only option she could see. Maria began moving toward a position that would give her a clearer shot at the helicopter during its next pass. If she could hit the pilot or co-pilot, the aircraft might crash in the middle of the enemy forces, creating chaos and possibly eliminating a significant number of Taliban fighters. As she moved, Maria thought about Isabella, her 7-year-old daughter who would be celebrating her birthday soon. She thought about the bedtime stories she'd promised to tell, the piano lessons she'd promised to attend, and the 1,000 small moments that made up a life worth living. But she also thought about Rabbit Chun and his baby daughter, and about 8 Navy SEALs who were counting on her to keep them alive. The helicopter completed its turn and began another pass toward the SEAL position. Maria could see the door gunners preparing to fire, their weapons trained on the rocky depression where Hawk's team was fighting for survival. This was her moment, her chance to turn the tide of a battle that seemed hopeless. Maria's scope tracked the aircraft as it approached, and she could see the pilot through the helicopter's windscreen. He was young, probably in his 20s, focused on maintaining his aircraft in the perfect position for his gunners to engage the Americans below. In a few seconds, he would be close enough for Maria to attempt a shot that would either save the SEAL team or mark the end of her own life. As the helicopter crossed into her engagement zone, Maria took a breath, held it, and prepared to take the most important shot of her career. 4 Toyota pickup trucks were moving toward the engagement area, each mounted with either heavy machine guns or recoilless rifles. The vehicles were moving with tactical precision, using terrain features to mask their approach until they could bring their weapons to bear on the American position. The situation had just escalated from a complex ambush to a full-scale attack involving mechanized infantry. The SEAL team was equipped for a reconnaissance mission, not a conventional firefight against a reinforced enemy company. Without immediate air support or reinforcement, they were facing annihilation. But Maria Santos hadn't survived 3 tours in Afghanistan by giving up when things looked impossible. She'd survived by adapting, by finding solutions when there appeared to be none, and by refusing to accept defeat as long as she had ammunition and the ability to fight. The approaching vehicles presented new challenges, but they also presented opportunities for someone with the right skills and the courage to act. As the sound of diesel engines grew louder in the valley below, Maria began planning her next moves. The vehicles would have to slow down to navigate the rocky terrain near the SEAL position, providing brief windows of opportunity for precision engagement. If she could disable the lead vehicles, she might be able to create a traffic jam that would slow the entire convoy. More importantly, she knew that someone in those vehicles was the tactical commander who'd orchestrated this entire operation. If she could identify and eliminate the leadership, the attack might lose its coordination and give the SEALs a fighting chance to break contact and withdraw to safety. Negative, Reaper 6. Maintain your position. That's an order. The response came from base command, but Maria was already breaking down her position and preparing to move. She'd been a Marine for 12 years, and she'd never disobeyed a direct order. But she'd also never been asked to watch good men die when she had the ability to help them. As Maria gathered her equipment and prepared to leave her overwatch position, she thought about the oath she'd taken when she became a Marine. To protect and defend to leave no one behind, to uphold the values that made her country worth fighting for. Sometimes those values conflicted with orders, and when they did, Maria had always chosen to follow her conscience rather than her career. The descent from her position would take her through terrain that offered little cover and would expose her to enemy fire from multiple directions. It was the kind of tactical movement that instructors used as an example of what not to do in combat. But Maria had advantages that regular infantry didn't possess. She was a sniper, trained to move unseen through hostile territory. More importantly, she was motivated by something stronger than survival instinct, the knowledge that 8 American warriors were counting on her to keep them alive. As she began her movement toward the trapped SEALs, Maria Santos didn't know that her actions over the next few hours would earn her the Navy Cross and a place in military history. She only knew that her brothers needed help, and she was the only one in position to provide it. The mountains of Afghanistan had seen many heroes born in moments of crisis, but few would match what was about to unfold in the valley below.